Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into one of the most brutal survival challenges pirates ever faced, finding clean drinking water in the middle of the endless ocean. And honestly, this stuff will make you appreciate every sip from your tap. We're talking about a time when running out of water meant certain death, and pirates had to become master water hunters just to survive another day. I've been fascinated by this topic because it's literally life or death. No dramatic flair needed when dehydration is your enemy. What blows my mind is how these supposedly lawless criminals develop some of the most ingenious water collection and preservation techniques in maritime history. So hit that like button if you're ready for some seriously engaging history. And drop a comment letting me know your thoughts. I genuinely love hearing from you all. Get comfortable, maybe grab a glass of water. You'll appreciate it more after this. And let's sail into the desperate world of pirate hydration. Picture this. You're on a wooden ship in the middle of the Caribbean, surrounded by millions of gallons of water that will literally kill you if you drink it. The irony is almost cruel. Water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. For pirates, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the difference between life and a slow, agonizing death. Dehydration kills faster than starvation. And out there on the open ocean, fresh water was more precious than any treasure they could steal. The average human needs about 2 liters of water per day just to survive, but pirates needed even more. They were doing physical labor under the scorching sun, hauling ropes, climbing rigging, and fighting battles. Salt spray constantly hit their faces, and the ocean wind dried them out faster than you'd think. Add in the fact that they were often drinking rum, which actually dehydrates you, and you've got a recipe for disaster. What's wild is that many pirate ships carried crews of 100 to 300 men, and each person needed their daily water ration. Do the math, that's potentially 600 liters of fresh water needed every single day just for basic survival. Now imagine trying to store that much water in wooden barrels for months at sea, with no refrigeration, no purification systems, and constant threat of contamination. The logistics alone would make modern supply chain managers break out in cold sweats. But here's where it gets really interesting. Pirates couldn't just sail to the nearest port whenever they ran low. They were literally outlaws, banned from most civilized harbors. Spanish colonies would shoot them on sight, British ports had bounties on their heads, and even friendly territories might turn hostile if the political winds changed. So they had to become completely self-sufficient water hunters, developing techniques that would make survival experts jealous. The psychological pressure must have been insane. Imagine watching your water barrels slowly empty, knowing that the next rainstorm might be weeks away. Ship captains had to make impossible decisions. Do you ration water so strictly that your crew becomes too weak to fight? Or do you maintain strength and risk running out completely? Mutinies often started over water disputes, because when you're dying of thirst, even the most loyal crew member will turn against their captain. What fascinates me most is how this desperate need for water-shaped pirate culture itself, they developed an almost religious reverence for rain, celebrating storms that would terrify normal sailors. Pirates became expert weather readers, able to spot potential rain clouds from miles away. They turned water collection into an art form, with every crew member knowing exactly what to do when those precious drops started falling from the sky. This whole water crisis also explains why pirates were so drawn to tropical islands and coastal areas. It wasn't just about finding treasure or avoiding naval patrols. They needed those freshwater streams, natural springs, and seasonal rainfall patterns. The Caribbean became pirate central partly because it offered the best combination of water sources and strategic hiding spots. Every successful pirate captain had to be part warrior, part navigator, and part hydrologist. The desperation for clean water also drove some of the most innovative thinking in maritime history. These weren't educated engineers or scientists, they were mostly illiterate sailors and criminals, but necessity forced them to become inventors, developing water collection systems that wouldn't look out of place in a modern survival manual. They turned their ships into floating water factories, ready to capture every drop that fell from the sky. All right, so we've established that water was literally life or death for pirates. And now we're getting to the really fascinating part, how they turned their entire ships into massive rain-catching machines. I'm talking about some seriously ingenious engineering here, and these weren't trained professionals. These were mostly illiterate sailors who figured out water collection systems that would impress modern survival experts. What gets me excited about this topic is how desperate necessity drove incredible innovation. When your life depends on catching every single drop of water that falls from the sky, you become pretty creative pretty fast. The moment storm clouds appeared on the horizon, pirate ships transformed into something completely different. Picture this. The entire crew would spring into action faster than you've ever seen anyone move, because they knew this might be their only chance to refill their water supplies for weeks. The deck would become busier than a shopping mall on Black Friday, with every single crew member having a specific job in the rain collection system. It's honestly incredible how organized these supposedly chaotic pirates became when water was involved. The genius of pirate rainwater harvesting started with their sails. Those massive sheets of canvas that normally caught wind became giant water funnels during storms. Pirates would adjust the sails at specific angles, creating what they called water channels that directed rainwater exactly where they wanted it to go. The forward sails were the most prized positions because they caught the cleanest water, less bird droppings, and salt spray contamination. Crew members would literally fight over who got to position which sail, because everyone understood that clean water meant survival. But here's where it gets really clever. Pirates didn't just rely on sails. They turned every single surface of their ship into a water collection system. Those wooden railings and gutters that normally kept seawater from washing across the deck became water highways during rainstorms, channeling precious fresh water straight into waiting containers. Some particularly creative pirates even carved extra grooves into the deck planking to help guide more water toward their collection points. They were basically redesigning their ships on the fly to maximize water capture. The collection process itself was both systematic and chaotic at the same time. Pirates would position barrels, buckets, and any container they could find at strategic points around the ship. But they learned through bitter experience that the first few minutes of rainfall were usually contaminated with salt, bird droppings, and other nasties that had accumulated on the ship's surfaces. Smart pirates would let this initial dirty water wash everything clean before they started seriously collecting. They called it letting the deck have its bath. What I find absolutely hilarious is that during big storms, you'd see pirates running around with their hats turned upside down, trying to catch extra water. Some would even strip off their shirts and wring them out into containers when they got soaked. One Spanish merchant ship captain wrote about watching a pirate crew that looked like they were doing some bizarre rain dance, when really they were just trying to maximize their water collection known. Imagine being a feared pirate and having to explain to your enemies that you're not performing some intimidating ritual, you're just really thirsty. The technical aspects of their systems were surprisingly sophisticated. Pirates learned to create multi-level collection networks, where water would flow from the sails down through a series of gutters and channels, eventually ending up in their largest storage barrels. They'd use everything from pieces of canvas to wooden planks to create these water highways. Some ships even had permanent modifications, extra gutters and channels built right into the ship's structure, specifically for rain collection. One of the most detailed accounts comes from buccaneer William Dampier, who described how his crew managed to save 23 barrels of rainwater during a storm, plus extra water for cooking. That's over 400 gallons of fresh water collected in a single storm, enough to keep a large crew alive for weeks. Another pirate crew on a ship called the Morning Star caught so much rain during one storm that they had enough water for 2 extra weeks at sea, and they celebrated by having a rain feast where everyone got extra water rations. To us, that might not sound like much of a party, but back then it was better than finding a chest full of gold. The really skilled pirates became amateur meteorologists out of necessity. They learned to read cloud formations, wind patterns, and even bird behavior to predict when and where they might encounter rain on. Some crews would actually adjust their entire sailing route just to intercept storm systems where they thought they could collect water. Makes you wonder if some of those fearsome pirates were really just expert weather forecasters in disguise. But rain collection wasn't without its problems. The water they collected was often bitter and contaminated, especially when they used deck swabs and other dirty materials to soak up and wring out water. One sailor described the collected rainwater as being full of mud and maggots. Not exactly refreshing, but it kept them alive. Sometimes, the water was so nasty that crews couldn't even drink it. Despite being desperately thirsty, what really impresses me is how this whole rain collection system became part of pirate culture. They developed an almost religious reverence for storms, celebrating weather that would terrify normal sailors. Rain became more than just water. It was hope, survival, and sometimes the difference between life and death. The sight of storm clouds on the horizon could transform a desperate, dehydrated crew into an efficient water collecting machine in minutes. Now we're getting to the really fascinating part: how pirates turned desperation into science and figured out ways to actually purify the nasty water they managed to collect. Because, let's be real, just catching rainwater wasn't enough. When that water was often contaminated with everything from bird droppings to dead insects to whatever gross stuff had been sitting on the ship's deck. What absolutely blows my mind is how these supposedly uneducated criminals became amateur chemists and engineers out of pure necessity. They developed water purification techniques that were actually pretty sophisticated for their time, and some of their methods are still used by survival experts today. The first thing pirates learned was that clear water didn't necessarily mean clean water. They'd collect what looked like perfectly good rainwater, only to have crew members get violently sick from drinking it. Through trial and error, and probably a lot of painful experience, they figured out that water needed to be treated before it was safe to drink. This wasn't some scientific breakthrough they read about in a book. This was literally life or death experimentation happening on floating wooden laboratories. The most common purification method was boiling, which sounds simple but was actually pretty complicated on a wooden ship. Pirates had to be incredibly careful about starting fires on deck, especially during storms when they were most likely to be collecting water. They developed special fire-safe areas and used metal containers that could withstand high heat without cracking. Some ships even had dedicated water boiling stations, basically primitive water treatment facilities built right into the ship's structure. But here's where it gets really clever. Pirates discovered that they could use charcoal as a water filter, and this was centuries before anyone understood the science behind activated carbon filtration. They'd burn wood down to charcoal, crush it up, and create makeshift filters using cloth, sand, and these charcoal pieces. The water would slowly drip through these layers, coming out cleaner and better tasting than what they started with. One pirate captain named Bartholomew Roberts apparently had such an elaborate charcoal filtering system that his crew called it the captain's magic water machine. What's incredible is that they figured out layered filtration systems completely by accident. Pirates would use whatever materials they had: pieces of cloth, sand from beaches, crushed shells, and yes, charcoal from their cooking fires. They'd stack these materials in barrels or large containers, creating what were essentially primitive water treatment plants. The water was slowly filtered through each layer, with each one removing different types of contamination It's the same basic principle used in modern water filtration systems, but these guys figured it out through pure desperation and experimentation. Some pirates got really creative with their purification methods. They'd use pieces of copper or silver, metals they'd stolen from their raids, because they noticed that water stored in metal containers seemed to stay cleaner longer. We now know this works because copper and silver have natural antimicrobial properties, but back then it was just that shiny stuff makes the water taste better. Pirates were accidentally discovering the antibacterial properties of metals centuries before anyone understood why it worked. The distillation process was another technique. Some of the more sophisticated pirate crews developed. They'd heat seawater or contaminated fresh water until it turned to steam, then capture that steam and let it condense back into water. This process removed salt and most contaminants, giving them relatively pure water. The equipment was makeshift, usually involving stolen pots, pieces of cloth, and whatever tubing they could improvise. But it worked. Captain Henry Morgan's crew reportedly had such an elaborate distillation setup that they could turn seawater into drinking water, which was basically like having a superpower back then. But the real genius was in how they tested their water purification methods. Pirates developed their own quality control systems, usually involving brave or expendable crew members who would taste test the treated water. They learned to recognize the signs of good versus bad water, the smell, the color, even how it felt in their mouths. Some crews had designated water tasters, whose job was literally to risk their lives, testing whether the purified water was safe to drink. Talk about a high-stakes job description. The psychological aspect of water purification was just as important as the technical side. When you're desperately thirsty and someone hands you a cup of murky, questionable water, it takes serious mental strength to wait for it to be properly treated. Pirates had to develop incredible discipline around water consumption, resisting the urge to drink contaminated water even when they were dying of thirst. This kind of delayed gratification probably saved more pirate lives than any sword fighting skill. What really gets me is how these purification techniques became part of pirate culture and knowledge. Experienced pirates would teach newer crew members the water arts, how to recognize good water, how to build filters, how to properly boil and treat contaminated supplies. This knowledge was passed down through generations of pirates, creating an informal but incredibly effective education system. A pirate who knew how to purify water was more valuable than one who could just fight, because water skills kept the entire crew alive. The innovation didn't stop there. Some pirate crews developed portable purification kits that they could take on shore raids. These would include small pieces of charcoal, cloth filters, and metal containers for boiling. When they raided coastal towns or explored islands, they could quickly set up water treatment stations and turn questionable water sources into safe drinking supplies. It was like having a mobile water treatment plant that could be assembled anywhere. The final piece of the pirate water puzzle was storage and rationing. And honestly, this is where things got really intense because we're talking about life or death resource management on floating wooden prisons. What absolutely fascinates me is how pirates had to become master logisticians, calculating exactly how much water each crew member could have per day, while still maintaining enough reserves for emergencies. These weren't accountants or supply chain managers. They were criminals and sailors who developed water management systems that would make modern military quartermasters jealous. The psychology of water rationing must have been brutal, knowing that every sip you took meant less for your crewmates, and every day that passed brought you closer to potential disaster. The storage technology itself was surprisingly sophisticated for the time period. Pirates used massive wooden casks called tuns and hogsheads that could hold anywhere from 63 to 252 gallons of water each. A decent-sized pirate ship would need about 30 of these monster barrels just to hold enough water for a month at sea, and that's nearly 2. 0 gallons sloshing around in the ship's hold. These weren't your backyard beer kegs. We're talking about carefully crafted oak containers with staves at least an inch thick, bound with iron hoops, and sealed with tar and resin mixtures. What blows my mind is the craftsmanship that went into these water barrels. The casks had to be tight or wet barrels, specifically designed to prevent any liquid from getting in or out. The oak staves were cut from trees averaging 3 feet in diameter, and the whole construction process was more art than science. Coopers worked to no written measurements or patterns and depended on long experience and instinct alone. Think about that. Your life literally depended on some craftsman's ability to eyeball the perfect, watertight seal. But storing the water was only half the battle. Keeping it fresh was where pirates really had to get creative. After a few weeks at sea, the combination of heat, moisture, and wooden walls created the perfect breeding ground for all sorts of nasty organisms. Pirates called contaminated water live water because you could actually see tiny creatures swimming around in it. One pirate's journal from 1716 described it as drinking a mouthful of wiggling worms, with every sip too. Absolutely disgusting. But that was reality when you're months away from any fresh water source. The innovations pirates developed to fight water contamination were genuinely impressive. They discovered that charring the inside of barrels basically turned them into giant charcoal filters, creating a protective barrier that helped keep water fresh longer. Some crews would drop silver coins into their water barrels because they noticed it helped preserve the water. They didn't understand the science behind it, but modern research has proven that silver really does have natural antibacterial properties. Pirates were accidentally discovering antimicrobial treatments centuries before anyone understood why they worked. The rationing system itself was where pirate leadership skills really got tested. Captains had to make impossible calculations. How much water could each crew member have per day while still maintaining reserves for emergencies, extended voyages, or unexpected delays? The average human needs about 2 liters of water daily just to survive, but pirates needed more because they were doing physical labor under the scorching sun too. Add in the fact that they were often drinking rum, which actually dehydrates you, and you've got a mathematical nightmare that could literally kill everyone if you got it wrong. What's really interesting is how water rationing became a form of social control on pirate ships. The person who controlled the water supply controlled the crew's survival, which gave captains enormous power over their men, but it also created incredible tension. Mutinies often started over water disputes because when you're dying of thirst, even the most loyal crew member will turn against their captain. Some ships had designated water guards whose job was to protect the water barrels and ensure fair distribution. But even these guards had to be watched because the temptation to steal extra water was overwhelming. The psychological pressure of water rationing must have been absolutely brutal. Imagine watching your daily water ration slowly decrease as supplies ran low, knowing that the next rainstorm might be weeks away. Pirates developed elaborate rituals around water distribution. 12 some crews would gather in a circle while the water was measured out, ensuring everyone could see that the portions were fair. Others would have the captain personally hand out each crew member's daily ration, turning water distribution into a daily reminder of who held the power of life and death. The storage locations on ships were carefully chosen for both practical and security reasons. Water barrels were typically kept in the coolest part of the ship, usually near the waterline, because pirates learned that every 10-degree increase in temperature could cut preservation time in half 3. But the coolest areas were also where the ship moved the most, so crews had to choose between slightly less contaminated water or barrels that weren't constantly trying to break free and roll around like bowling balls in an earthquake. Some of the more desperate storage innovations are honestly hilarious in hindsight. One crew tried wrapping their barrels in wet sailcloth, hoping evaporation would keep them cool. Great idea in theory, but they just ended up with moldy sailcloth and water that still went bad. Another crew painted their barrels white to reflect heat, only to discover that white paint in the 1700s contained lead, which definitely made the water last longer, but for all the wrong reasons. The most superstitious pirates thought bad water was caused by evil spirits and would perform elaborate blessing ceremonies over new barrels, complete with chants and dances. What really gets me is how this whole water storage and rationing system shaped the entire culture of piracy. Pirates weren't just lawless criminals. They were forced to become incredibly disciplined about resource management because their lives literally depended on it. The skills they developed for water preservation, storage, and rationing were probably more valuable than any sword fighting ability. A pirate who could make water supplies last an extra week was worth more to the crew than someone who could win a dozen duels. This whole water crisis also explains so much about pirate behavior and strategy. Why were they so drawn to tropical islands and coastal areas? Why did they risk everything to raid merchant ships that might only be carrying basic supplies? Why did successful pirate captains need to be part warrior, part navigator, and part logistics expert? It all comes back to water, that precious, life-giving resource that was more valuable than any treasure they could steal. Looking back at this whole journey through pirate water management, what strikes me most is how these desperate circumstances forced incredible innovation, from rainwater collection systems to purification techniques to storage and rationing methods. Pirates developed survival technologies that were genuinely ahead of their time. They turned their ships into floating water factories, ready to capture, clean, and preserve every drop they could find. And all of this happened because they had no choice. It was innovate or die. Literally. Hey everyone, we're diving into our second major story tonight. How pirates managed to keep food from rotting on ships for months at a time. And honestly, this is going to make you appreciate your refrigerator in ways you never imagined. We're talking about an era when a single piece of spoiled meat could kill you, and pirates had to become master food scientists just to avoid starving or poisoning themselves in the middle of the ocean. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how these supposedly lawless criminals developed some of the most sophisticated food preservation techniques in maritime history. They turned their ships into floating pantries that could keep food edible for months without any refrigeration, electricity, or modern preservatives. The challenge was absolutely brutal. Imagine trying to feed 100 to 300 hungry pirates for months at sea, using only the food preservation technology available in the 1600s and 1700s. We're talking about wooden ships with no climate control, sailing through tropical heat and freezing storms, with food stored in the dampest, most bacteria-friendly environment you could possibly imagine. The ship's hold was basically a giant petri dish where everything was constantly wet, warm, and moving around. Add in rats, insects, and the fact that pirates couldn't exactly pop into the local grocery store when they ran out of supplies, and you've got a food preservation nightmare that would make modern food scientists break out in cold sweats. But here's what blows my mind. Pirates couldn't afford to get food poisoning like people on land could. When you're on solid ground and you eat something bad, you might get sick for a few days, but you'll probably recover. On a pirate ship, food poisoning could literally kill you because there were no doctors, no hospitals, and definitely no modern medicine. One bad piece of meat could take out half the crew, leaving the ship defenseless against enemies or unable to operate properly. So food preservation wasn't just about avoiding hunger, it was about survival, combat, readiness, and maintaining enough healthy crew members to actually sail the ship. The psychological pressure must have been insane. Picture being the ship's cook, responsible for keeping dozens of pirates fed with food that's been sitting in a damp wooden box for weeks. Every meal was basically a gamble. Will this meat kill everyone, or will it keep them strong enough to fight? Pirates had to develop an almost supernatural ability to detect spoiled food, learning to recognize the subtle signs of contamination that could mean the difference between life and death. They became experts at reading the color, smell, and texture of food in ways that would impress modern food safety inspectors. What's really interesting is how food preservation shaped the entire culture of piracy. Pirates weren't just randomly sailing around looking for treasure. Their entire route planning had to revolve around food acquisition and preservation. They needed to know where they could find fresh supplies, which islands had the best preservation materials, and how to time their raids to maximize their food storage capabilities. A successful pirate captain had to be part warrior, part navigator, and part food scientist. The economic aspect is fascinating too. Preserved food was literally more valuable than gold in some situations. Pirates would fight bloody battles over ships carrying salt, spices, or other preservation materials. A cargo hold full of properly preserved meat could keep a pirate crew alive for months, making it worth more than any treasure chest. Some pirates became specialists in raiding merchant ships, specifically for their food supplies, developing detailed knowledge about which trade routes carried the best preserved foods. The innovation that came out of this desperate need for food preservation was absolutely incredible. Pirates developed techniques that were centuries ahead of their time, creating preservation methods that modern survival experts still use today. They turned their ships into floating food laboratories, experimenting with different combinations of salt, smoke, spices, and storage methods. Every successful technique was passed down through generations of pirates, creating an informal but incredibly effective education system. But the real genius was in how they adapted land-based preservation techniques for life at sea, taking methods that work perfectly fine on solid ground and making them work on a constantly moving, damp, unstable wooden platform requires serious creativity. Pirates had to reinvent everything from smoking techniques to salt curing methods, creating new approaches that could handle the unique challenges of ocean life. They were basically pioneering marine food science centuries before anyone understood the scientific principles behind what they were doing. What really gets me excited about this topic is how these preservation techniques became part of pirate identity. A crew that could keep their food fresh longer, could stay at sea longer, travel farther, and take on more ambitious raids. Food preservation skills were as important as sword fighting or navigation, maybe more important, because you can't fight or sail if you're dead from food poisoning. Pirates who mastered these techniques became legends, known throughout the Caribbean for their ability to keep crews fed and healthy during extended voyages. The variety of preservation methods they developed is absolutely mind-blowing. We're not just talking about basic salting and smoking. Pirates created complex multi-step processes that involved everything from fermentation to dehydration to chemical preservation using natural compounds. They turned food preservation into an art form, with master preservers who could keep meat edible for months using nothing but salt, smoke, and whatever materials they could find or steal. These weren't educated chemists or food scientists. They were mostly illiterate sailors who figured out advanced preservation chemistry through pure trial and error. Now we're diving into the real meat of pirate food preservation, literally. And I'm talking about the holy trinity of keeping food edible at sea: salt, smoke, and pure desperation, fueled creativity. What absolutely blows my mind is how pirates turned these basic preservation methods into a sophisticated science that kept entire crews alive for months without any refrigeration or modern technology. We're talking about techniques that were so effective Some of them are still used by survival experts and gourmet chefs today. The chemistry behind what these pirates were doing was actually incredibly advanced. They just didn't know they were doing chemistry. Salt was literally the superhero of pirate food preservation, and I mean that in the most dramatic way possible. Pirates needed absolutely massive amounts of salt. We're talking about quantities that will make modern food safety inspectors have panic attacks. A single barrel of salted beef could contain more salt than a pirate's entire yearly intake, which is saying something considering how much salt they probably consumed just from accidentally swallowing seawater during storms. The process was both simple and brutal. They would coat chunks of meat or fish with thick layers of salt that pulled out moisture faster than a thirsty sailor, emptying his rum ration. But here's where it gets really interesting and kind of gross. The salt didn't just preserve the meat, it completely transformed it into something that looked more like a ship's plank than dinner. The meat would become so hard and salty that eating it straight up would be like trying to chew on leather boots, though probably tastier depending on where you got your boots. Pirates had to soak this rock-hard salted meat in water for hours before they could even attempt to eat it, and even then it was about as appetizing as you'd expect. But it kept them alive, and a well-salted barrel of meat could last for months, sometimes even up to a year if they got the process just right and stored it in the coolest, driest part of the ship. The really clever part was how pirates learned to use different types of salt for different preservation needs. Sea salt was the most common because, well, they were surrounded by the ocean, but they discovered that rock salt worked better for long-term preservation. Some pirates would actually raid coastal salt mines specifically to get the good stuff, treating salt like the precious commodity it was. They developed elaborate systems for rationing salt because running out meant watching your food supplies rot and your crew slowly starve. When salt supplies ran low, which happened more often than you'd think, pirates had to get creative with alternative preservation methods. Enter the sun-drying technique, which was probably discovered by some hungry pirate who left their fish out too long and realized it hadn't gone bad. The process was deceptively simple, but getting it right was trickier than sword fighting. Pirates would slice their meat or fish into thin strips, much like making jerky today, then lay these strips out on clean canvas or wooden racks on the deck during the hottest part of the day. But here's where pirates had to become amateur meteorologists to make sun-drying work. They learned to read cloud formations, wind patterns, and even bird behavior to predict when they might encounter the perfect drying conditions. A sudden rainstorm could ruin days of drying progress, turning their precious food into a moldy mess faster than you could say, walk the plank. Some clever crews developed makeshift covers they could quickly throw over their drying racks when storm clouds appeared on the horizon. The biggest challenge wasn't actually the weather, it was the local wildlife, especially seagulls that turned these drying sessions into all-you-can-eat buffets. The smoking technique was where pirates really showed their innovative genius. They had to figure out how to maintain controlled fires on wooden ships without burning the whole thing down, talk about high-stakes cooking. Pirates discovered that different woods gave their food different flavors, and they became unexpectedly picky about their smoking materials. They refused to use pine wood because it made the meat taste like ship's tar, instead preferring hardwoods like oak or fruit woods when they could get them. Some crews would actually store special smoking wood alongside their other supplies, taking up precious cargo space that could have been used for loot. The smoking process itself was fascinating. First, they'd prepare the meat by cutting it into strips and rubbing it with salt, then hang these strips on racks above a very low fire, making sure the smoke could circulate around each piece. The real magic happened over the next 24 to 48 hours as the smoke slowly penetrated the food, depositing tiny particles that not only added flavor, but also created a protective outer layer. One of the most remarkable aspects was how pirates learned advanced techniques from Caribbean natives who had been smoking food for generations. They discovered that smoking fish with certain local aromatic woods could make it last twice as long as regular smoking. Fire safety was obviously a huge concern when you're trying to smoke food on a wooden ship filled with gunpowder. Most crews had strict rules about smoking food on board. One rule from 1723 specified that anyone caught smoking meat without the captain's permission would be marooned on the next island they found. Harsh, but considering they were trying to prevent the ship from burning down, may be fair enough. The amount of food pirates could smoke at once was pretty impressive, though. A good-sized smoking rack could handle up to 200 pounds of meat or fish at a time. What really gets me excited about this whole preservation system is how it accidentally solved other problems pirates didn't even know they had. The smoking process kept mosquitoes and other insects away from their coastal camps, and the salt preservation methods help prevent scurvy by maintaining some vitamin content in the food. Pirates were basically stumbling into advanced food science through pure trial and error, developing techniques that modern survival experts still study and use today. The success rates of these preservation methods varied wildly depending on conditions. In perfect weather, with the right materials, about 70–80% of the food would preserve well enough to last several months. But rushing the process or dealing with humid conditions could result in food that spoiled within weeks, which could literally mean the difference between life and death for an entire crew. Pirates learned to hedge their bets by preserving smaller batches more frequently rather than risking their entire food supply on one big preservation session. Now we're getting to the really wild part of pirate food preservation: hardtack and living protein, which is basically a fancy way of saying weevil-infested bread and whatever fish they could catch. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how pirates learned to turn what most people would consider disgusting food disasters into actual survival advantages. We're talking about bread so hard it could literally be used as a weapon, and protein sources that were still crawling around when you ate them. The psychology of eating food that's actively trying to escape your mouth must have been intense, but pirates developed this incredible ability to see nutrition where other people saw nightmare fuel. Hardtack was basically the ultimate survival food, a simple mixture of flour, water, and salt that was baked until it became harder than most rocks. The recipe was deceptively simple, but getting it right was crucial because this stuff had to last for months without any preservatives or refrigeration. Pirates would bake these thick, dense crackers until they were completely bone dry, creating what was essentially edible concrete that could survive anything the ocean threw at it. A properly made piece of hardtack could last for years if kept dry, and there are stories of hardtack from the 1600s still being technically edible centuries later. But here's where it gets really interesting and kind of gross. Hardtack was basically a mobile ecosystem. Within weeks of being stored in the damp ship's hold, these crackers would become infested with weevils, small beetles that would lay their eggs inside the bread. Most people would throw out weevil-infested food, but pirates learned to see this as a feature, not a bug. Literally, the weevils were actually adding protein to their diet, and experienced pirates would tap their hardtack on the table before eating it, not to get the bugs out, but to see how many were in there. More weevils meant more protein, which was actually a good thing when you're trying to survive on a limited diet. The eating process itself was pretty hilarious when you think about it. Hardtack was so hard that trying to bite into it directly could literally break your teeth, so pirates had to develop creative ways to make it edible. The most common method was to soak it in water, rum, or whatever liquid they had available until it softened enough to chew. Some pirates would crumble it up and mix it into their stews or soups, creating what was basically the world's first instant meal. Others would fry it in whatever fat they could find, turning it into a kind of primitive French toast that probably tasted about as good as you'd expect. What really gets me is how hardtack became part of pirate culture and identity. Experienced pirates could tell the quality of hardtack just by looking at it. The color, the texture, even the sound it made when you tapped it. They developed their own grading system, with the best hardtack being reserved for officers and the worst stuff going to the newest crew members. Some pirates became so skilled at making hardtack that they could create different varieties. Some harder for long-term storage, others slightly softer for immediate consumption. The innovation around hardtack preparation was surprisingly sophisticated. Pirates learned that adding different ingredients could change the preservation properties. A little extra salt made it last longer, while adding some fat made it more nutritious but reduced storage time. Some crews would add herbs or spices when they could get them, not just for flavor, but because certain plants had natural preservative properties. The most creative pirates would even add crushed nuts or dried fruits when they were available, creating what was basically the world's first energy bar. But the real protein innovation came from fishing and what pirates called living provisions. Unlike land-based people who could hunt or raise livestock, pirates had to become expert fishermen just to supplement their preserved food supplies. They developed incredibly sophisticated fishing techniques that could work from a moving ship, using everything from simple hooks and lines to elaborate net systems. Some pirate ships had dedicated fishing crews whose job was to constantly work the waters around the ship, bringing in fresh fish whenever possible. The fishing innovations were genuinely impressive. Pirates learned to read water conditions, fish behavior, and even bird patterns to predict where they might find the best fishing. They developed special hooks and lures that could attract different types of fish, and they became experts at preserving their catch quickly before it spoiled. Some crews had elaborate systems for keeping caught fish alive in makeshift tanks or nets, ensuring they had fresh protein available for days after a successful fishing session. What's really wild is how pirates turned fishing into a competitive sport. Crews would compete to see who could catch the most fish, the biggest fish, or the most unusual species. These competitions weren't just for fun, they were crucial for morale and survival, because the crew that caught the most fish got better nutrition and higher status. Some pirates became legendary for their fishing skills, with stories of individual fishermen who could single-handedly feed an entire crew. The preparation of fresh fish was where pirates really showed their creativity. They learned to use every part of the fish, the meat for immediate consumption, the bones for making broth, and even the scales and organs for various purposes. Fish heads were particularly prized because they contained oils and nutrients that were hard to get from other sources. Pirates developed dozens of different ways to prepare fish, from simple grilling over open fires to complex stews that could stretch a small catch to feed a large crew. The psychological aspect of eating living protein was probably the most challenging part. When you're eating bread that's crawling with bugs and fish that might still be moving, you have to develop a pretty strong stomach. Pirates learned to see this as normal, even desirable, because it meant their food was fresh and nutritious. They developed rituals around eating these foods, turning what could have been disgusting experiences into bonding moments for the crew. What really impresses me is how these food innovations became part of pirate survival culture. The ability to eat hardtack without complaining, to appreciate weevil protein, and to catch and prepare fresh fish became markers of pirate toughness and experience. New crew members were often tested on their ability to handle these foods, and those who couldn't adapt were seen as weak or unsuitable for pirate life. It was basically a food-based initiation system that separated the real pirates from the wannabes. All right, we've covered the hardcore preservation techniques, and now we're getting to what I think is the most fascinating part: how pirates turned coastal raids and island stops into elaborate food supply networks. This is where pirate food preservation meets adventure, strategy, and sometimes pure desperation. What absolutely blows my mind is how these supposedly chaotic criminals developed incredibly sophisticated trading and foraging systems that would make modern supply chain managers jealous. We're talking about pirates who could navigate not just the seas, but complex networks of food sources, seasonal availability, and cultural exchange that kept entire crews fed for months. The tropical foraging game was where pirates really showed their adaptability and intelligence. When they hit Caribbean islands, they weren't just looking for buried treasure, they were conducting what was basically advanced agricultural reconnaissance. Pirates learned to identify dozens of edible plants, fruits, and roots that could supplement their preserved food supplies. We're talking about coconuts, plantains, breadfruit, and wild yams that could be harvested quickly and either eaten fresh or preserved for the next leg of their journey. Some pirate crews became so skilled at tropical foraging that they could completely resupply their fresh food stores in just a few hours on shore. What's really impressive is how pirates learned from indigenous populations about which plants were safe to eat and how to prepare them properly. This wasn't just casual observation. Pirates developed genuine relationships with local communities, trading goods and knowledge in ways that benefited everyone involved. They learned that plantains could be dried and stored for weeks, that certain palm hearts were incredibly nutritious, and that some tropical fruits could be fermented into alcoholic beverages that also help preserve other foods. It was like having access to a living encyclopedia of survival knowledge that you couldn't get from any European cookbook. The seasonal timing of these foraging expeditions was crucial and required serious planning. Pirates had to know when different fruits ripened, when certain fish were most abundant, and when weather conditions would be best for food preservation activities. A crew that arrived at an island during mango season could stock up on fresh fruit that would last for weeks, while the same island visited at the wrong time might offer nothing but coconuts and whatever they could catch from the sea. This seasonal knowledge became part of pirate navigation. They weren't just plotting courses to avoid naval patrols. They were timing their routes to maximize food acquisition opportunities. But here's where it gets really interesting. The pirate food trade network was way more sophisticated than most people realize. Pirates didn't just raid merchant ships for gold and silver. They specifically targeted vessels carrying food supplies, spices, and preservation materials. Salt was so valuable that pirates would attack ships, carrying it with the same intensity they'd show for treasure galleons. They developed detailed intelligence networks about which trade routes carried the best food supplies, when harvest seasons would make certain goods more available, and which ports had the most valuable preservation materials. The trading relationships pirates developed were genuinely complex and often mutually beneficial. They'd trade stolen goods, captured supplies, or even their services as fighters in exchange for fresh food, preservation materials, and local knowledge. Some Caribbean communities actually welcomed pirate visits because they brought exotic goods and were willing to pay well for fresh supplies. Pirates became unofficial merchants, creating economic relationships that kept both sides fed and supplied. It was like an early version of international trade, except with more swords and significantly less paperwork. What really gets me excited about this topic is how pirates turned food acquisition into a form of cultural exchange. They learned cooking techniques from Spanish colonists, preservation methods from indigenous peoples, and trading practices from Dutch merchants. A single pirate crew might use Caribbean smoking techniques, European salting methods, and African spice combinations all in the same meal. They were accidentally creating fusion cuisine centuries before it became trendy, driven by pure necessity and survival instincts. The logistics of coordinating these food supply operations were incredibly complex. Pirates had to balance the need for fresh supplies with the risks of spending time in port where they might be captured or attacked. They developed hit-and-run foraging strategies, where small groups would quickly gather supplies, while the main crew kept the ship ready for immediate departure. Some crews became so efficient at these operations that they could completely resupply their food stores in less than 6 hours, including time for preservation activities. The innovation in portable food processing was genuinely impressive. Pirates developed lightweight, portable equipment that could be quickly set up on beaches for smoking, drying, or salting fresh food. They created modular preservation kits that could be assembled anywhere, turning any beach into a temporary food processing facility. Some crews had designated short teams whose job was to set up these processing stations while others gathered fresh supplies. It was like having a mobile food factory that could be deployed wherever they found good foraging opportunities. The psychological impact of fresh food on pirate crews was enormous. After weeks of eating hardtack and salted meat, the opportunity to gather fresh fruits, vegetables, and fish was like Christmas morning. Pirates would literally fight over who got to join the foraging parties because it meant access to fresh food and a break from the monotony of preserved supplies. These shore expeditions became crucial for morale, giving crews something to look forward to and helping prevent the kind of desperation that could lead to mutiny. What's really wild is how some pirate crews developed specialized roles around food acquisition. They'd have designated foragers who knew which plants were safe, fishing specialists who could quickly catch fresh protein, and preservation experts who could process large quantities of food in minimal time. These weren't just random assignments. Pirates recognized that food skills were as important as fighting ability, and they organized their crews accordingly. A pirate who could identify edible plants or knew how to quickly smoke fish was more valuable than someone who could just swing a sword. The success of these food supply networks often determined which pirate crews survived and which ones didn't. Crews that developed good relationships with coastal communities, learned effective foraging techniques, and mastered portable preservation methods could stay at sea longer and take on more ambitious raids. Those that relied only on raiding for food supplies often found themselves weakened by malnutrition or forced to take desperate risks just to find their next meal. Food network management became a crucial leadership skill that separated successful pirate captains from those who ended up dead or captured. Looking back at this whole journey through pirate food preservation, what strikes me most is how these desperate circumstances created incredible innovation and cultural exchange. Pirates weren't just preserving food, they were creating international networks of knowledge sharing, developing new preservation techniques, and accidentally advancing food science through pure trial and error. They turned survival into an art form, combining techniques from multiple cultures and climates to create food systems that could sustain them through months of dangerous ocean travel. And all of this happened because they had no choice. It was innovate or starve, literally. All right, everyone, we're shifting gears into our third story tonight. And honestly, this one hits different because we're talking about something that could literally kill you in minutes, freezing to death on the open ocean. I've always been fascinated by how pirates dealt with cold weather, because most people think of them as these tropical Caribbean guys with suntans and palm trees. But the reality is way more brutal. Pirates sailed everywhere, from the icy waters off Newfoundland to the bone-chilling North Atlantic, where hypothermia was a silent killer that took more lives than any sword fight. What gets me excited about this topic is how these tough-as-nails sailors had to become survival experts, developing warming techniques that would make modern outdoor enthusiasts jealous. Picture this. You're on a wooden ship in the middle of the North Atlantic in February, with nothing but thin layers of whatever clothes you could steal or afford, and the ocean wind is cutting through you like a knife. The temperature is dropping below freezing. Salt spray is turning to ice on your face, and you're expected to climb rigging and handle ropes with hands that are so cold you can't feel your fingers. This wasn't just uncomfortable. This was life or death survival mode, where one wrong move could mean falling into water so cold it would kill you in minutes. Pirates had to figure out how to stay warm enough to function while doing dangerous physical work in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The psychological challenge was probably just as brutal as the physical one. When you're shivering uncontrollably and your body is shutting down from cold, it takes incredible mental strength to keep working and stay alert. Pirates couldn't just huddle under blankets and wait for warmer weather. They had to maintain their ships, stand, watch, and be ready to fight at a moment's notice. The cold wasn't just making them miserable, it was making them vulnerable to attack, less effective at their jobs, and more likely to make fatal mistakes. What's really wild is how cold weather shaped pirate strategy and behavior. Crews that couldn't handle freezing conditions were basically stuck in warm waters, limiting their raiding opportunities and making them predictable to naval forces. But pirates who mastered cold weather survival could attack merchant ships in northern waters where other pirates wouldn't dare to go. They could use harsh weather as a tactical advantage, striking when their enemies least expected it and disappearing into storms that would kill less prepared crews. The medical reality of hypothermia was terrifying, and pirates learned to recognize the warning signs through bitter experience. First came the uncontrollable shivering, then the loss of fine motor control that made it impossible to tie knots or handle weapons properly. As body temperature dropped further, pirates would become confused and disoriented, making poor decisions that could doom the entire crew. The final stages were the most dangerous. When shivering stopped and the person seemed to feel warm again, that was actually a sign that death was minutes away. Pirates developed their own crude but effective methods for treating hypothermia. They learned that rubbing frostbitten skin actually made it worse. So instead, they'd use gradual warming techniques like sharing body heat or slowly warming the person near a fire. Some crews had designated warming stations below deck where hypothermic crew members could be treated, complete with extra blankets and whatever hot liquids they could manage. The buddy system became crucial. Pirates would pair up to watch each other for signs of dangerous cold exposure. What really impresses me is how pirates turned cold weather survival into a form of crew bonding. When you're all freezing together and depending on each other for warmth and survival, it creates incredibly strong relationships. Pirates would share their warmest clothes with sick crew members, take extra watch shifts so others could warm up, and develop elaborate systems for rotating who got to sleep in the warmest spots. The cold forced them to become more cooperative and less individualistic because everyone understood that crew survival meant personal survival. The innovation that came out of desperate cold weather situations was genuinely impressive. Pirates learned to recognize weather patterns that could bring deadly cold snaps, allowing them to prepare or seek shelter before conditions became fatal. They developed early warning systems where crew members would watch for signs of dangerous weather and alert the rest of the ship. Some experienced pirates could predict temperature drops hours in advance just by reading cloud formations, wind patterns, and even the behavior of seabirds. The economic impact of cold weather on pirate operations was huge. Crews that couldn't handle freezing conditions missed out on lucrative raiding opportunities in northern waters, where merchant ships carried valuable cargo like furs, whale oil, and preserved fish. Pirates who mastered cold weather survival could extend their raiding season by months, operating in conditions that would force other crews to retreat to warmer waters. This gave them access to trade routes and targets that were essentially undefended, because no one expected pirates to be crazy enough to attack in freezing weather. But the real genius was in how pirates learned to use cold weather as a weapon against their enemies. They timed their attacks for the coldest parts of storms, when merchant ship crews would be huddled below deck trying to stay warm. Pirates who were properly prepared for cold weather could board and capture ships while their victims were too cold and disoriented to fight effectively. It was like having a secret advantage that turned harsh weather from an obstacle into a tactical tool. Now we're getting to the really clever part, how pirates turned layering into a survival art form and basically invented the modern concept of dressing for the weather centuries before outdoor gear companies existed. What absolutely fascinates me about pirate cold weather clothing is how they had to become master strategists about every single piece of fabric they put on their bodies. We're talking about life or death fashion decisions, where the wrong choice could literally mean freezing to death in the middle of the ocean. These weren't fashion statements, they were survival systems that had to work in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The layering system pirates developed was genuinely sophisticated and way ahead of its time. They learned that wearing one thick layer was actually worse than wearing multiple thin layers because trapped air between the layers acted as insulation. Pirates would start with a base layer, usually a thin linen shirt that could wick moisture away from their skin. Then they'd add a wool vest or waistcoat, followed by their regular work shirt, and finally top it off with whatever outer layer they could find or steal. The key was that each layer had to be loose enough to allow air circulation, but tight enough to trap warm air. What's really impressive is how pirates learned to adapt their clothing based on different types of cold weather. Dry cold required different strategies than wet cold, and pirates became experts at reading weather conditions to decide how to dress. For dry, windy conditions, they'd focus on wind-resistant outer layers and make sure their extremities were covered. But for wet, cold conditions, which were way more dangerous, they had to prioritize waterproof materials and quick-drying fabrics that wouldn't trap moisture against their skin. The materials pirates used for cold weather clothing were whatever they could get their hands on, but they developed strong preferences based on what actually worked. Wool was the absolute gold standard because it retained its insulating properties even when wet, a crucial advantage when you're constantly getting splashed by ocean spray. Pirates would literally fight over woolen clothing captured from merchant ships because they knew it could mean the difference between life and death during cold weather voyages. Leather was prized for outer layers because it blocked wind and provided some water resistance, though it became stiff and uncomfortable in extreme cold. But here's where pirates really showed their innovation, and they learned to modify and customize their clothing for maximum warmth. They'd stuff extra fabric or even dried grass between layers to create additional insulation. Some pirates would sew pockets into their clothing specifically for carrying small heated stones or metal objects that could provide warmth for hours. Others would create removable linings that could be added or taken away, depending on the weather conditions. It was like having a modular clothing system that could be adapted to any situation. The extremities were where pirates really had to get creative, because frostbite could disable a crew member permanently. Hands were the biggest challenge since pirates needed dexterity to handle ropes, weapons, and ship equipment. They developed a system of wearing thin inner gloves made from silk or fine wool, covered by thicker mittens that could be quickly removed when they needed to use their fingers. Some pirates would even carry spare gloves inside their shirts, keeping them warm and dry until they needed to switch out wet or frozen pairs. Foot warmth was equally crucial, and pirates learned that keeping feet dry was more important than keeping them warm. They'd stuff their boots with whatever insulating material they could find: wool, dried grass, even shredded rope. The really clever pirates would carry extra socks and rotate them throughout the day, keeping dry pairs warm inside their clothing while wearing the others. Some crews even developed communal sock drying systems where wet socks would be hung near the ship's cooking fires and rotated among crew members. Head and neck protection was where pirates really showed their understanding of heat loss. They learned that you could lose up to 40% of your body heat through your head and neck, so covering these areas was crucial for overall warmth. Pirates would wear tight-fitting wool caps under their regular hats, and many developed the habit of wrapping scarves or cloth around their necks, even in moderate weather. The most experienced cold weather pirates would never go on deck without some kind of head covering, no matter how tough they wanted to appear. What's really wild is how pirates turned stolen clothing into survival gear. When they raided merchant ships, they weren't just looking for valuable items to sell, They were conducting strategic clothing acquisition missions. Pirates would specifically target ships carrying wool, fur, or other cold weather materials. They became experts at identifying high quality fabrics and would sometimes value a good wool coat more than a bag of silver coins. Some pirate crews even had designated clothing specialists, whose job was to evaluate and distribute captured garments based on their survival value. The maintenance of cold weather clothing was crucial and required constant attention. Pirates learned that wet clothing could kill you faster than no clothing at all, so they developed elaborate systems for drying and maintaining their gear. They create drying areas below deck where wet clothes could be hung near cooking fires or oil lamps. Some crews had rules about sharing, drying space, and rotating clothing, so everyone had access to dry gear. Pirates also learned basic repair techniques, patching holes and reinforcing weak spots that could let in cold air or water. The psychological aspect of cold weather clothing was just as important as the physical protection. When you're properly dressed for cold weather, you feel more confident and capable, which translates into better performance and decision making. Pirates who had good cold weather gear were more willing to take on dangerous tasks and could work longer shifts without becoming exhausted. Conversely, pirates who were constantly cold became irritable, made poor decisions, and were more likely to get sick or injured. What really impresses me is how these clothing innovations became part of pirate culture and identity. Experienced pirates could look at someone's clothing and immediately assess their cold weather survival skills. The way you layered your clothes, the materials you chose, and how you maintained your gear all became markers of pirate competence and experience. New crew members were often judged on their ability to dress appropriately for cold weather, and those who couldn't adapt were seen as liabilities. The success of these clothing systems often determined which pirate crews could operate in northern waters and which ones were stuck in tropical regions. Crews that mastered cold weather clothing could extend their raiding season by months, accessing trade routes and targets that were essentially undefended because other pirates couldn't handle the cold. This gave them enormous strategic advantages and access to valuable cargo that warm weather pirates never saw. Cold weather clothing expertise became a form of competitive advantage that separated successful pirate crews from those that struggled to survive. Now we're wrapping up our cold weather survival story. And honestly, this final piece is where pirates really showed their genius, turning fire, rum, and pure human connection into the ultimate survival strategy. What absolutely blows my mind is how these tough, individualistic criminals learned that surviving extreme cold was actually a team sport that required incredible cooperation and trust. We're talking about pirates who would literally share their body heat with crew members they might have been fighting with just hours earlier because they understood that everyone's survival depended on everyone else staying warm. This whole communal warmth thing became the foundation of pirate brotherhood in ways that most people never realize. Fire management on a wooden ship was like playing with dynamite while juggling, incredibly dangerous but absolutely necessary for survival. Pirates had to become master fire engineers, creating heating systems that could warm the crew without burning down their floating home. They developed elaborate fire safety protocols that were way more sophisticated than anything you'd find on land. The ship's cook wasn't just responsible for food. They were basically the chief heating engineer, managing fires that had to provide warmth, cook meals, and dry wet clothing, all at the same time. Some crews had designated fire watches, whose only job was to monitor heating fires and make sure they didn't get out of control. The innovation around shipboard heating was genuinely impressive. Pirates learned to create warming stations in the safest parts of the ship, usually near the galley where cooking fires were already burning. They'd use metal braziers filled with charcoal or small pieces of wood, carefully positioned to maximize heat distribution while minimizing fire risk. Some crews even developed portable heating devices, basically small metal containers that could hold hot coals and be moved around the ship as needed. The really clever pirates would heat stones or metal objects near the cooking fires, then wrap them in cloth and use them as personal heating devices that could stay warm for hours. But here's where rum becomes more than just a drink. It becomes a legitimate survival tool. Pirates discovered that alcohol could create a temporary warming sensation that helped crew members get through the worst cold snaps. They learned to ration rum specifically for cold weather emergencies, giving small amounts to crew members who were showing signs of hypothermia. The alcohol would cause blood vessels to dilate, creating a feeling of warmth that could help someone survive until they could get to proper shelter. Of course, they also learned that too much alcohol could actually make hypothermia worse, so experienced pirates became experts at administering just the right amount. What's really fascinating is how pirates turned rum into a social warming ritual. During the coldest weather, crews would gather in small groups and share warm rum mixed with whatever spices they had available. These weren't just drinking sessions. They were carefully orchestrated survival activities where pirates would take turns warming up while others maintained watch. The shared drinking created a sense of camaraderie and mutual support that was crucial for morale during brutal cold snaps. Some crews even had special cold weather rum that was mixed with honey, spices, or other ingredients that were supposed to provide extra warmth. The body heat sharing techniques pirates developed were both practical and surprisingly intimate for such a rough culture. When someone was seriously hypothermic, the fastest way to warm them up was direct skin-to-skin contact with another warm person. Pirates would literally strip down and share body heat, taking turns being the warming partner for crew members who were in danger. This created incredibly strong bonds between crew members, because when someone has literally saved your life by sharing their body heat, you develop a loyalty that goes way beyond normal friendship. The sleeping arrangements during cold weather were like a complex logistics operation. Pirates learned that sleeping alone in cold weather was basically suicide, so they developed communal sleeping systems where crew members would share blankets and body heat. The warmest sleeping spots were rotated among crew members, ensuring that everyone got a chance to properly warm up. Some crews even had warming schedules where pirates would take turns being in the middle of sleeping groups where they could absorb heat from multiple people. It sounds weird, but when you're literally freezing to death, personal space becomes a luxury you can't afford. What really impresses me is how these survival techniques became part of pirate culture and identity. The willingness to share warmth, rum, and fire became markers of pirate loyalty and brotherhood. Crew members who hoarded warmth or refused to help others stay warm were seen as traitors to the pirate code. Conversely, pirates who were generous with their warmth and willing to sacrifice their own comfort for others became respected leaders. Cold weather survival became a test of character that revealed who could be trusted and who couldn't. The psychological impact of these communal warming strategies was enormous. When you're sharing body heat, fire, and rum with your crewmates, it creates an intimacy and trust that's hard to replicate in other situations. Pirates who survived brutal cold weather together developed bonds that lasted for life. These shared survival experiences became the foundation of pirate loyalty, creating crews that would literally die for each other. The cold weather didn't just test their physical survival skills, it forged the emotional connections that made pirate crews so effective and loyal. The success of these warming strategies often determined which pirate crews could operate in northern waters and which ones were stuck in tropical regions. Crews that mastered fire management, rum rationing, and body heat sharing could extend their raiding season by months, accessing valuable trade routes that warm weather pirates couldn't reach. This gave them enormous strategic advantages and access to cargo that other pirates never saw. Cold weather survival expertise became a form of competitive advantage that separated successful pirate crews from those that struggled to survive. Looking back at this whole journey through pirate cold weather survival, what strikes me most is how extreme conditions forced these tough individualists to become incredibly cooperative and caring toward each other. The cold didn't just test their physical endurance, it revealed the human connections that made pirate crews more than just collections of criminals. They learned that survival wasn't about being the toughest individual, but about creating systems of mutual support that could keep everyone alive. Fire, rum, and body heat became the tools that transformed desperate pirates into brothers who would literally warm each other through the darkest, coldest nights at sea. All right, everyone, we're diving into our fourth story tonight, and honestly, this one is going to make you appreciate solid ground in ways you never imagined. We're talking about what happened when a pirate's floating home started falling apart in the middle of the ocean, and I mean literally falling apart, with water rushing in and the whole ship threatening to become a very expensive coffin. What absolutely fascinates me about ship repairs at sea is how pirates had to become master engineers, carpenters, and problem solvers all at the same time, often while dealing with storms, enemy attacks, and the constant threat of drowning. These weren't trained shipbuilders. They were mostly criminals and sailors who had to figure out how to perform major surgery on their wooden homes while those homes were still moving through dangerous waters. Picture this. You're hundreds of miles from the nearest land, and suddenly you hear that terrifying sound of wood cracking under pressure. Water starts pouring into the ship's hold, and you realize that your floating fortress is about to become your floating tomb. The panic must have been absolutely overwhelming, not just because of the immediate danger, but because everyone on board knew that if they couldn't fix the problem quickly, they were all going to die together. There's no calling for roadside assistance when you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and there's definitely no swimming to safety when the nearest land is weeks away. What really gets me is how ship damage could happen so suddenly and catastrophically. A single cannonball during a battle could punch a hole in the hull that would sink the entire ship in minutes. Storms could snap masts, tear sails, and crack the ship's frame in ways that made it impossible to sail properly. Even normal wear and tear was constantly threatening. The constant movement of the ship would loosen joints, the salt water would rot wood, and the stress of carrying heavy cargo and cannons would gradually weaken the entire structure. Pirates were basically living in houses that were slowly falling apart while being constantly attacked by the elements. The psychological pressure of emergency ship repairs must have been insane. When water is rushing into your ship and everyone's life depends on your ability to fix the problem, there's no room for mistakes or hesitation. Pirates had to work with incredible speed and precision while dealing with the terror of knowing that failure meant death for everyone on board. The crew members doing the repairs were literally working underwater in many cases, holding their breath while trying to patch holes or reinforce damaged areas. It's like performing surgery while the patient is having a heart attack. Everything has to be perfect, and you only get one chance. What's really impressive is how pirates developed emergency response systems that could mobilize the entire crew in minutes. When damage was discovered, everyone had specific roles. Some crew members would start pumping water out of the ship, others would gather repair materials, and the most skilled would assess the damage and plan the repair strategy. These weren't chaotic panic responses. They were carefully organized operations that had been practiced and refined through bitter experience. Pirates learned that the first few minutes after discovering damage were crucial, and they developed systems that could get repair crews working almost instantly. The innovation that came out of these desperate repair situations was genuinely remarkable. Pirates had to figure out how to patch holes, reinforce weak spots, and jury-rig solutions using whatever materials they had on hand. They couldn't just order replacement parts or wait for professional shipwrights. They had to become master improvisers who could turn anything into a ship repair tool. Pieces of sail became emergency patches. Rope became structural reinforcement. And even personal belongings were sacrificed to keep the ship afloat. The most terrifying repairs were the ones that had to be done from outside the ship. When there was hull damage below the waterline, someone had to go over the side and work underwater to patch the hole. This was basically a suicide mission. The person doing the repair had to hold their breath, work in freezing water, and somehow manage to attach a patch while the ship was still moving. Pirates developed primitive diving techniques and underwater repair methods that were centuries ahead of their time, driven by pure desperation and the knowledge that failure meant death. What really strikes me is how these emergency repairs became tests of pirate loyalty and courage. The crew members who volunteered for the most dangerous repair jobs, like going underwater to patch hull breaches, became heroes and leaders. These weren't just acts of bravery. They were demonstrations of commitment to the crew's survival that created incredibly strong bonds between pirates. When someone risks their life to save your ship, you develop a loyalty that goes way beyond normal friendship. The success rate of emergency repairs was probably terrifyingly low. For every ship that managed to patch itself up and limp to safety, there were probably dozens that couldn't be saved and went down with all hands. Pirates were essentially gambling with their lives every time they attempted major repairs at sea, but they had no choice. It was either try to fix the ship or definitely die. The ocean floor is probably littered with pirate ships that almost made it, where the repairs failed at the last minute or the damage was just too extensive to fix. Now we're getting to the really fascinating part. How pirates turned whatever random junk they had lying around into legitimate ship repair materials. And honestly, this is where their creativity and desperation combined to create some of the most ingenious problem solving in maritime history. What absolutely blows my mind is how these supposedly uneducated criminals became master engineers and inventors when their lives depended on it. We're talking about people who could look at a broken mast, a torn sail, and a pile of random cargo and somehow figure out how to turn it all into a functioning ship repair system. The innovation that came out of these desperate situations was genuinely centuries ahead of its time, driven by pure necessity and the knowledge that failure meant death for everyone on board. The basic principle of pirate ship repair was simple but brutal. Use whatever you have because you're not getting anything else. When a cannonball punched a hole in the hull, pirates couldn't just order replacement planks from the local shipyard. They had to look around their ship and figure out what could be turned into a patch. Pieces of sail became emergency hull patches, spare rope became structural reinforcement, and even personal belongings were sacrificed to keep the ship afloat. I've read accounts of pirates using everything from wooden chests to cooking pots as temporary patches, basically turning their entire ship into a giant repair kit. What's really impressive is how pirates developed systematic approaches to material repurposing. They learned to categorize everything on their ship based on its potential repair value, not just its original purpose. That spare piece of canvas wasn't just for making new sails, it was emergency patching material. Those extra ropes weren't just for rigging, they were structural reinforcement waiting to happen. Even food barrels could be broken down and used as hull patches if the situation was desperate enough. Pirates basically lived in floating hardware stores where everything had multiple potential uses. The rope work involved in emergency repairs was absolutely incredible. Pirates had to become master rope engineers, using different knots and lashing techniques to hold their makeshift repairs together. They developed specialized knots that could secure patches under water pressure, lashing systems that could reinforce broken masts, and rope networks that could literally hold the ship together when the original structure failed. Some of these rope techniques were so advanced that they're still used by modern sailors and riggers today. The amount of rope knowledge required to keep a damaged ship afloat was honestly mind-blowing. But here's where it gets really creative. Pirates learned to use tar and pitch as universal repair materials. These substances were originally used for waterproofing, but pirates discovered they could be used to seal almost any kind of damage. They'd heat tar until it became liquid, then use it to seal cracks, secure patches, and even reinforce weak joints. The process was dangerous. Heating tar on a wooden ship was basically playing with fire, but it was incredibly effective. A well-applied tar patch could make a temporary repair last for weeks, giving the crew time to reach port or find better materials. What really gets me excited about this topic is how pirates turned metal objects into repair tools. They'd use stolen silverware as small patches, melt down pewter plates to create waterproof seals, and even use iron nails and bolts in creative ways to secure repairs. Some pirates became skilled metal workers out of necessity, learning to shape and modify metal objects to fit their repair needs. They'd use ship's tools like hammers and chisels to create custom repair pieces, basically turning their ship into a floating blacksmith shop. The fabric innovations were equally impressive. Pirates learned that different types of cloth had different repair properties. Canvas was great for large patches, silk was perfect for sealing small leaks, and wool could be used as padding or insulation. They developed techniques for layering different fabrics to create composite patches that were stronger than any single material. Some repairs involved multiple layers of different cloths, each serving a specific purpose in the overall patch system. It was like creating custom engineered repair materials using whatever fabric they could find or steal. The wood repurposing techniques were absolutely brilliant. When pirates needed replacement planks, they'd break down furniture, cargo crates, or even parts of the ship's interior structure. They learned to identify which types of wood were suitable for different repairs: hardwoods for structural work, softwoods for temporary patches, and seasoned wood for areas that needed to withstand water pressure. Some pirates became expert carpenters, able to shape and fit replacement pieces with nothing but basic hand tools. They'd use everything from dining tables to weapon racks as raw materials for ship repairs. What's really wild is how pirates learned to create composite repair materials by combining different substances. They'd mix tar with rope fibers to create a kind of primitive fiberglass, combine cloth with pitch to make waterproof patches, and even use hair and other organic materials as binding agents. These composite materials were often stronger and more durable than the original ship components they were replacing. Pirates were accidentally inventing advanced material science centuries before anyone understood the principles behind what they were doing. The tool improvisation was equally impressive. When pirates needed specialized repair tools that they didn't have, they'd create them from whatever was available. Cooking utensils became precision instruments. Weapons were repurposed as construction tools. And even personal items like belt buckles could be turned into repair hardware. Some pirates became incredibly skilled at tool modification, able to turn almost any metal object into exactly the tool they needed for a specific repair job. The success of these makeshift repairs was surprisingly high, considering the materials and conditions involved. A well-executed emergency repair using improvised materials could keep a ship afloat for weeks or even months. Some pirates became so skilled at makeshift repairs that their patched-up ships were actually stronger than they had been originally. The constant cycle of damage and repair created ships that were basically floating patchworks of different materials, held together by ingenuity and desperation. What really strikes me is how these repair innovations became part of pirate culture and knowledge. Experienced pirates would teach newer crew members the repair arts, how to see potential repair materials in everyday objects, how to improvise tools, and how to create strong patches from weak materials. This knowledge was passed down through generations of pirates, creating an informal but incredibly effective education system. A pirate who could turn random junk into ship repairs was more valuable than one who could just fight, because repair skills kept the entire crew alive. Now we're wrapping up our ship repair story. And honestly, this final piece is where pirates really showed their mastery, turning hidden coves and secret beaches into floating shipyards that could bring a dying vessel back to life. What absolutely fascinates me about careening and coastal repairs is how pirates had to become master strategists, choosing locations that were defensible, accessible, and equipped with everything they needed to perform major ship surgery. We're talking about pirates who could look at a coastline and immediately assess its potential as a temporary shipyard, evaluating everything from tidal patterns to defensive positions to the availability of repair materials. This whole process of careening, basically beaching your ship and tipping it on its side for repairs, was like performing open heart surgery on your floating home while constantly watching for enemies. The location scouting for careening operations was incredibly sophisticated and required genuine expertise. Pirates needed beaches with the right combination of factors: gentle slopes that could support a ship's weight, protection from storms and enemy attacks, fresh water sources for the crew, and access to the materials they'd need for repairs. They became expert geologists, able to assess whether a beach's sand and rock composition could handle the massive weight of a fully loaded ship. The wrong choice could result in the ship getting stuck permanently or, even worse, collapsing and breaking apart during the repair process. Some pirate crews spent weeks scouting potential careening sites, testing different beaches, and evaluating their suitability for major repair operations. What's really impressive is how pirates turned careening into a precise science. The process started with careful timing. They had to coordinate the operation with tidal patterns, ensuring they could beach the ship at high tide and have enough time to complete repairs before the next high tide. Getting the timing wrong could leave them stranded on the beach or force them to abandon the repair halfway through. Pirates developed elaborate tidal charts and timing systems, becoming amateur oceanographers who could predict water levels days in advance. The most experienced crews could careen a ship, complete major repairs, and get back to sea in a single tidal cycle, basically performing ship surgery in less than 12 hours. The actual careening process was like watching a controlled shipwreck in reverse. Pirates would use ropes, pulleys, and sheer manpower to tip their ship onto its side, exposing the underwater hull for repairs. This required incredible coordination and trust, because one mistake could crush crew members or damage the ship beyond repair. They'd use everything from tree branches to stolen cargo as supports and cushions, creating elaborate scaffolding systems that could hold a multi-ton ship at the perfect angle for repair work. The engineering involved was genuinely impressive. These weren't trained shipwrights, but they developed techniques that would make modern marine engineers jealous. What really gets me excited about this topic is how pirates turned these repair operations into temporary communities. While the ship was being repaired, the entire crew would set up camp on the beach, creating makeshift villages complete with cooking areas, sleeping quarters, and workshop spaces. These weren't just repair sites. They were social hubs where different pirate crews would meet, trade information, and share repair techniques. Some popular careening locations became unofficial pirate gathering places, where crews would coordinate their activities and form alliances. It was like having temporary pirate conventions focused entirely on ship maintenance and survival. The innovation that happened during these coastal repair operations was absolutely remarkable. Pirates would use local materials in creative ways. Palm fronds became waterproof patches. Local hardwoods were carved into replacement parts, and even beach sand was used as an abrasive for smoothing hull repairs. They learned to work with whatever the local environment provided, adapting their repair techniques to use indigenous materials and methods. Some repairs incorporated local knowledge from indigenous populations, creating hybrid techniques that combined European shipbuilding with native coastal expertise. These collaborative repairs often resulted in ships that were stronger and more seaworthy than they had been originally. The defensive aspects of careening operations were crucial and required constant vigilance. A ship undergoing repairs was completely vulnerable. It couldn't move, couldn't fight effectively, and was basically a sitting duck for any enemy that discovered the location. Pirates had to post guards, create early warning systems, and develop escape plans in case they were attacked during repairs. Some crews would position smaller boats nearby, ready to evacuate the crew if the main ship couldn't be saved. The most paranoid pirates would even prepare to destroy their own ship rather than let it fall into enemy hands. What's really wild is how these repair operations became part of pirate culture and tradition. Successful careening sites were passed down through generations of pirates, with detailed knowledge about their advantages and potential dangers. Some locations became legendary in pirate lore, places where famous crews had performed miraculous repairs, or where multiple ships had been saved from certain destruction. Pirates would share stories about these sites, creating an oral tradition that preserved crucial survival knowledge. The ability to successfully careen and repair a ship became a mark of pirate competence and leadership. The success rate of these coastal repair operations was surprisingly high, considering the risks and challenges involved. A well-executed careening operation could completely transform a damaged ship, making it seaworthy for months or even years. Some pirates became so skilled at coastal repairs that they could essentially rebuild their entire ship using nothing but local materials and basic tools. These repair operations often resulted in ships that were actually stronger than they had been originally because the repairs incorporated lessons learned from previous damage. The psychological impact of successful ship repairs was enormous for pirate crews. When you've watched your floating home nearly sink and then seen it restored to seaworthiness through skill and teamwork, it creates an incredible sense of accomplishment and crew unity. These repair operations became bonding experiences that strengthened crew loyalty and demonstrated the value of cooperation. Pirates who had survived major repair operations together developed bonds that lasted for life because they had literally saved each other's lives through their combined efforts. Looking back at this entire journey through pirate ship repairs, what strikes me most is how these desperate circumstances forced incredible innovation and cooperation. From emergency patches made from random materials to sophisticated coastal repair operations, pirates developed ship maintenance techniques that were genuinely ahead of their time. They turned survival into an art form, creating repair methods that kept their floating homes alive in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The skills they developed, improvisation, teamwork, and the ability to see potential solutions in impossible situations were probably more valuable than any treasure they could steal. These weren't just repairs. They were acts of creative survival that transformed desperate pirates into master engineers and innovators.